What I would like to do today is just share with you what was one of the most incredible experiences for me, which is to have the privilege of being physically present in Paris when one of the most momentous events, I think, in history happened. The Paris Peace Accord was signed by 196 presidents. I was not in the inner circle with 196 presidents and prime ministers. I was in the next circle out with 50,000 people. But I did have, since I have for a long time had certification as a certified non-government organization, I was able with my colleague to go in and out of the conference a little bit. But what I really want to do is share some insights from that event, the backstory, because it was interesting how we got to, or how they got to sign the agreement, and then, more importantly, share some lessons learned that I think are going to be applicable right here in Pleasant Bay and throughout all of Cape Cod. And then lastly tonight, I'd like to announce or propose and get your response to this idea of taking the Paris model of what happened with 196 presidents and replicating that here on Cape Cod. Because it's really going to be think globally and act locally. And that's what we have to do. So that's a little snippet. I'm not going to talk about the Center for Coastal Studies at any length, but I do, and we've been around for 40 years, by the way, doing research, education, and public policy work for all coasts and oceans, including Pleasant Bay. But what I wanted to mention was we had a bit of an epiphany ourselves, maybe 10 years ago, when all of our scientists and colleagues at the center kind of collectively realized every bit of work we do in these different disciplines relates in one way or another, or is impacted one way or the other by climate change. So we put our climate change lenses on, in all our work since then has been focused, and it will be for the next 40 years, on how can we contribute to solutions to climate change. Science that matters, because climate change obviously is something that matters to all of us. One good thing about being in Paris and discussing climate change, everybody, the 50,000 people and the 196 presidents and prime ministers, realized the science was settled. We did not have to deal with climate deniers. We did not have to deal with delays and obfuscation of the facts by climate deniers that has cost us 20 or 30 years, perhaps, of action in this country and elsewhere. We all agreed the science is settled. So I'm not going to do a lot of science except for this one chart. And I like to do this one because, having played hockey for many decades myself, that's a hockey stick up there. The famous hockey stick curve is very representative of just about every trend that you could want to measure today, whether it's increased temperature of the Earth's surface, increased temperature of the ocean, amount of carbon dioxide that's being emitted. They're all taking that quick turn in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And you can see here, yes, we used models and typical scientific methodologies like core samples and tree rings to track the change or the temperature going back 1,000 years, but those red numbers are actual measurements, things like thermometers, basic equipment. So there's no denying those numbers. And by the way, this chart only goes up to 2000. That red line continues at the same steepness for the last 13 years. And then when you use the models to project it further, it unfortunately is going to continue at that rate of increase unless we do some dramatic changes to the way we do business on Earth. And the leaders of the world have, especially people in the United Nations, have known this for 30 years. And they've been trying to deal with a treaty or some kind of agreement that would set the stage and the framework for slowing the rate of climate warming. The first big one you may remember was a thing called the Kyoto Protocols, 1997. That was an attempt from the top down, from the United Nations and government leaders to basically impose or get countries to agree to a mandatory treaty. It almost succeeded. Many countries signed on, and that Kyoto Protocol treaty is in effect today, except for a few countries, including the United States and other big countries, that did not sign it. When our negotiators came back and gave the agreement to President Clinton, the first President Clinton, my wife is in the audience, and I had to say that for her. He did not submit the treaty to the then U.S. Senate, knowing full well they would not ratify it. And that was the Senate in 1997. So you can imagine, with the deniers that still live in this Senate, how challenging it's going to be. In Copenhagen in 2009, we almost achieved success again. There was almost an agreement, but what reared its head then was the North-South divide. This is a situation where it turns out most of the developing country, or the developed countries, the ones that have been economically successful, are in the northern hemisphere of the world. It turns out most of the developing, or what we used to call undeveloped nations, are in the southern hemisphere. We have done in the northern hemisphere pretty well by polluting the atmosphere with driving our economy. And now we're saying to the developing countries in the southern hemisphere, don't do it like we did. That inequity basically was the fatal flaw for an agreement in Copenhagen, because the developing countries would not sign on until the advanced countries made some kind of compensation. And then in 2014, a new approach was put in motion that ultimately was the reason why we were successful, or they were successful. No, it's we. We were successful in Paris. 196 presidents and prime ministers came together, signed an agreement to slow the rate of climate warming. I emphasize that because we've put so much in motion already that it's going to continue for a while. We're just trying to mitigate it as we go into the out years. But it's a historic measure by any measurement. Never have that many presidents come together. One little fun story, they all showed up. The prime ministers and the presidents showed up, and the UN organizers had to accommodate opening speeches for 196 people. All right? Not just people, presidents and prime ministers, long-winded people. They were divided in half. Half of them were given auditorium A, half of them auditorium B. They were all said 3 minutes, and the mic shut off. It took them a day to get through that. Do the math. That's a lot of, some people might say hot air, but it was really a tremendous achievement, and it started the Paris discussions beautifully, because the presidents, the top people, said this is important. We're here. And at the end, after the agreement was signed, President Hollande made this statement. In Paris, there have been many revolutions over the centuries. Today, it is the most beautiful and most peaceful revolution that has just been accomplished, a revolution for climate change. And sincerely, it felt like a revolution. You know, I was inspired by the first Earth Day and all the protests and the good things we did around that. This was like another Earth Day with 50,000 people from all walks of life. Indigenous people, people from the business sector, people from nonprofits, educators, theologians. It was a nice cross-section of the world. But here's what I want to just share with you, some insights, because there were it didn't happen easily. There were 4 difficult issues that had to be negotiated. What was going to be the target? Would it be a treaty again, like they tried before, and you know they'd answer, or voluntary? And how to measure progress, very important. How are we going to know whether we're making any progress? And then who's going to pay for it? So with regard to the mechanism, what was decided was not to pursue a treaty, but to invite every country in the world to come to Paris with a voluntary commitment. No criteria involved. Just what do you plan to do in your country to mitigate climate change, meaning reduce the carbon dioxide that's being emitted in your country? So they came. They put all their commitments on the table. They all were added up. It made a pretty good impression. But the nice thing was it got everybody, every country, 196 countries, on the same page, signing a document. Right? The next thing was, how does that stack up against the target? Well, here is a chart that I'll spend a little bit of time with, because if you look at the left-hand side, if you see this, if we do nothing as a world society and continue business as usual, the average temperature of the Earth is projected to increase 4 degrees above the average temperature of the Earth at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So in 1850, when we started to really put carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the air, we want to go back to that. Well, we're measuring, that's our baseline. So if this goes up 4 degrees Celsius, that's trouble. That's catastrophic in many ways. So the United Nations said, going into the meeting, let's set 2 degrees Celsius as the target that we want to achieve. That will at least mitigate a lot of the most impacting changes. Well, when you add up those voluntary pledges that the 196 countries came to, their impact is only going to, if they all are implemented successfully, reach 3 degrees. That's reaching 3. It means keeping the average temperature from going beyond 3 degrees. So this is really key. And one of the other little things you probably didn't read about was, while the 2.5 weeks of negotiations were going on inside the auditorium, 100 nations were having, they called them secret discussions outside in the little cafes of Paris at night, in restaurants at night, and the United States participated in that. Senator John Kerry and his staff were part of that. These were the nations that are, most of them, little island nations in the South Pacific that really wanted to have 1.5 degrees be the target, because the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius literally could mean the life or death of island nations in the South Pacific. It also could mean the extent of mass flooding in Bangladesh and Indonesia and in India, displacing millions and millions of people, could be the difference in this. So they negotiated. Finally, they came back into the inner circle and said, we are here to make a statement. We're called the Higher Ambition Coalition. It's really a poetic name. And they said, we want 1.5. It went back and forth. The compromise in the end was to have the agreement say, let's shoot for 2 degrees, which is, by the way, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot. And endeavor to limit ourselves to 1.5 above pre-industrial. So it's there. The next question was, how are we going to measure success? And again, our delegation, Secretary Kerry was adamant about both of these points. The first one is, we, and the United Nations did this, establish criteria for measuring climate CO2 reductions. And you can do it. We'll talk about this later tonight, but there are ways to measure the carbon footprint of just about everything, whether it's a plane flying from Boston to Paris, or all the energy we're using in this room. We know what we're producing. It can be measured and judged. So that was put in place. That was good. I put 2 stars here because this, I think, might have been the most important take-home from Paris. When the 196 presidents left with their voluntary commitments, at that time, they were not scheduled to come back together for 20 years. Just wasn't going to work. So after a lot of hard negotiations, they all promised to come back every 5 years and submit new national commitments. So the good news is, everybody knew, leaving Paris, that it wasn't enough, but it was a good start, and everybody was in the game. Right now, they know they're going to have to come back in 5 years and up the ante significantly. Then the other big issue, the last issue, was that one that divided the world in Copenhagen in 2009. To solve that, the developed countries said, we'll create a $100 billion minimum annual fund by the year 2020 in order to help developing countries produce more renewable energy and all the things that they need to fulfill their commitments. But the same paragraph included this language about loss and damage, and explicitly will not be a basis for liability and compensation. So the lawyers in the room know what this is all about. This is the bread and butter for lawyers. But the idea here was the developed countries, the whole world in this case, acknowledged that there had been loss and damage from previous climate change impacts. A lot of it falling primarily on the developing countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and the potential for them coming back and going to the World Court and demanding reparations and compensation from the United States and other countries was serious. But they, right up front, agreed, we're not interested in holding you up for money. We want to move forward. So there was good feeling from the developing countries, but Secretary Kerry had to get this language in, because if he hadn't, the United States Senate would have had a rationale to take the treaty or the accord, the agreement, under its advisement, and then that would have been big trouble, just like it was back in 1997. So a lot of strategy behind this language, but it all worked out fine. What does all this mean? Well, it means that by somewhere between 2050 and 2100, pick a number, 2075, the world will be carbon neutral. That means any amount of carbon dioxide that we produce will be naturally assimilated, taken in, sequestered by trees, by the ocean, by any new technologies we hopefully will develop, and will be in balance. I mean, that's when people start to shake their heads and say, you know, we won't have gasoline and all that stuff anymore, oil? No, not at all. We can't. We'll have to leave trillions of cubic yards of natural gas in the ground, not drill for them. We'll have to leave billions of barrels of oil in the ground, not drill for them. So think about the impact of that. But that's what we're shooting for, and it's pretty ambitious. So why am I optimistic, given that last statement? Well, the uniqueness of 196 presidents, that's as much world leadership as you could ask for. True participation by the private sector. They were there not just to greenwash their products, but to see where they could bring their financial capabilities, their investment capabilities, and their technological capabilities to be part of the solution. And then meanwhile, outside and actually independent of the Paris Accord is the fact that the cost of producing renewable energy right now, solar and wind, has precipitously decreased, 70% and 80%. It's competitive with oil and gas right now. So in the end, the marketplace might be driving the success that we need. And then I double-starred this one because I think besides all this good stuff that happened, there were 11,000 other commitments from cities, regions, companies, investors, nonprofits, and I'm going to add this one for us tonight because we're going to be part of this movement. That's the whole idea. Right now, you may have read the papers. Mayor Walsh, Boston Mayor Walsh, and Secretary Kerry and others are in Beijing at a major conference on technologies that can be used to help mitigate climate change. And that conference, they announced, is coming to Boston in 2017. So the cities are making, and by the way, more than half, for the first time in the history of the world, more than half of the population lives in an urban settlement. And we've always been cave people, agrarian people, farm people, suburban people. More than half of the population of the world lives in an urban area, and that's going to continue. So having cities that are sustainable and producing minimum amounts of carbon dioxide is going to be key to our success. So one more thing about Paris before I get back to Pleasant Bay. Why was I there? I've mentioned a couple reasons, but the other one is that I helped found this organization called the Global Ocean Forum years ago, in part because of my interest in political science and governance. One of the problems for the world's oceans is there is not a lot of governance in the areas we call areas beyond national jurisdiction. So if you look at a world map, take every country and draw a 200-mile border around that country. Those 200 miles are under the legal jurisdiction, for the most part, of that country. It's called the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone. And you can see by that name, it's under their jurisdiction, so they can mine it and fish it and profit from it. That leaves the vast majority of the ocean high seas. And that's where a lot of the illegal fishing goes. It goes on, the dredging for molybdenum and other precious metals, and a lot of dumping. So a lot of stuff happens and needs to be governed. So that's why we started this Ocean Forum. We also realized that the oceans and climate are inextricably linked. People don't often stop and think about these basic science facts, but 50% of the oxygen we're breathing right now is produced by the ocean. It's not just because we're in Pleasant Bay. If you were in Springfield, it'd be the same thing, all right? And it's produced by really just the top millimeter of phytoplankton. Incredibly important linkage. The oceans so far have sequestered about 50% of all the carbon dioxide we've produced. So we've been getting away with murder, so to speak, by producing all this carbon dioxide with our industrial processes, and the ocean has been doing a great favor for us. But it's reached its what we call assimilative capacity. It can't absorb too much more. Oceans also drive our weather systems, and because they're changing, the basic chemistry and physiology of the ocean's changing, some of the currents are changing, and that means our weather patterns are changing. This could have dire consequences. And on the positive side, oceans have provided major source of protein for lots of nations over the years, and still do for a lot of developing countries. So this is just a little snippet of all what we call ecosystem services, benefits that the ocean provides for humanity. The problem is, not a lot of people recognize that, and certainly in my experience dealing with the United Nations and the World Bank and other international forums over the last 30 years, oceans were either just not on the radar screen, or taken for granted, or often, I think, psychologically, people are like, just too big to fail. For centuries, we thought we could remove any amount of biomass, basically overfishing, without causing impacts. We thought we could dump any amount of waste in without having it concentrate and cause problems. And now we have climate change impacts on top of that. The science is clearly showing, as Ted suggested in his opening comments, the oceans are failing, and we must do something about it. So there are the impacts. I won't go into all of them, but you've hopefully been aware of some of these things. This is happening to varying degrees in different parts of the world. It's not uniform, but these are impacts. I just mentioned the ocean currents potentially changing. That's one of them. So this was the message that we wanted the Global Ocean Forum wanted to bring to the negotiators and make sure it was part of the discussions, because we wanted oceans, the word ocean, if nothing else, in the agreement language. And we finally did achieve it. It was a big deal to get it in, but we worked hard to get it in. We had a side event, 54 high-level ministers and officials, 500 attendees, great speakers like Prince Albert II of Monaco, who's been a wonderful ocean champion for years. Tommy Ramagusa, the president of the Republic of Palau, who talked about having to move his whole nation to a different location in Australia, New Zealand. But the most moving speaker was Mary Robinson. Do you recognize her name? Former president of Ireland. And she now has been working with this thing called Climate Justice Foundation. And she spoke about the human impacts, not the science necessarily, or the politics, or the agreement. She said she brought home very clearly and very powerfully that the impact of climate change on the everyday lives of people, especially in developing countries, and particularly on women in those developing countries, is immense. So she was, if anyone would, it was appropriate to give a standing ovation in this forum, she deserved one. So coming back home from Paris to Pleasant Bay, once again, there are just some of the impacts. When we talk a little bit later, and my colleagues from the other organizations are up here with me to answer questions, I'm sure they'll be able to tell you in some more detail or answer questions about some of these impacts. But believe me, they're here, and not only are they here in Cape Cod, but we might turn out to be the world's hotspot for climate change impacts. Certainly with regard to the average temperature of the ocean in the waters in the Gulf of Maine and by extension Cape Cod. We've had a recent study by our colleague Andy Pershing at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, peer-reviewed, very, very well done study, tracking the average temperature of the ocean water over the last 35 years. So you can see there are variations. There are things we call oscillations. This is what, when the deniers say, well, it's going up, but it goes down. Yes, it does. It goes up and goes down. But the trend overall is going like this. And so as the summary of this report says, the Gulf of Maine, the average sea surface temperature of the Gulf of Maine have been rising over the last 35 years at nearly the fastest rate on the planet over the last 10 years. In 2012, had the warmest readings in the 150 years that humans have been collecting them. In the Center for Coastal Studies, water quality data validates that. We've been testing the waters here for the last 35 years as well in Cape Cod Bay, and we can validate that right here. So we are ready to, why was I in Paris? Well, Paris is more important to us than maybe other parts of the world. Here's a couple more facts on impact. Cape Cod National Seashore has some wonderful scientists. Superintendent Price is here today. We had a briefing on the loss of high marsh area in Cape Cod National Seashore. That's Nauset Marsh, Herring River in Wellfleet, Hatches Harbor, and Provincetown. So if you don't think climate change is impacting us, what this means is, without a lot of biology, there's a low marsh and a high marsh, two different plants. Spartina alterniflora is the higher part. That's the one you see closest to the road. A little further out, the lower marsh can take a lot of inundation with the tide and still survive. The upland marsh needs to have dryness and a little bit of water. Dry water, like tidal. As the sea level has been rising here in Cape Cod, that high marsh is inundated too often, maybe permanently, and dying off to the tune of 36, 42, and 25%. That's an impact we can measure, unfortunately, and we're seeing it here. Ocean acidification, when that carbon dioxide, CO2, overwhelms the ability of the ocean to absorb it. The CO2 combines with oxygen and becomes CO3, which is carbonic acid. Carbonic acid acidifies the ocean and results in things like coral reefs being really jeopardized. Some of our shellfish may be suffering. This is a thing we haven't been able to measure a lot of in our region, but we certainly are beginning to see it in other parts of the world. We can measure this, and here's something, if you don't believe things are changing, the intensity and rate of erosion is happening all along our coastline, and particularly since we're a sandy peninsula stuck out here in the ocean, we're especially vulnerable to this. Here's it's hard to recognize this unless you're familiar with it, but this is the old bathhouse at Herring Cove Beach in Provincetown, built in the 1950s by the state DPW. They figured, well, let's put the macadam parking lot right up to the edge of the beach, and it's been problematic ever since. And the instinct for some people would be, let's build that parking lot right back where it was before, because we want to drive our cars right down to the beach. Well, the Park Service, with some help from the scientists at the Center for Coastal Studies, is trying to be much more progressive in adapting to climate change. So this parking lot is going to be moved back 150 feet. We're going to reestablish the natural dune, which provides natural protection from the sand moving on and off shore rather than barricades of this, and people will still be able to recreate. So retreating wisely in the face of climate change is something we all are going to have to get familiar with and creative about. You've heard the fishermen the fishing industry debate who is overfishing. Are the fishermen being irresponsible? And for a while, our fishermen would come back in those debates and say, wait a minute, we may be taking too much fish, maybe not, but we think the fish are moving away. And in fact, their instinct was probably correct. To some degree, the fish that are left, caught fish in this case, have their habitat shifting offshore and further north to stay in the cold water that they need for their habitat. And examples of habitat shifting are going to be becoming more and more prevalent everywhere. Is it a big deal? Maybe the environment adjusts. It will certainly be a big deal sociological, economically for communities that lose their fishing grounds and move someplace else. So that's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of. And again, for the interest of the Center for Coastal Studies, many of you who may have heard of us before probably have read the headline about us disentangling an entangled whale or turtle. One of our major responsibilities is to work with NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service to help preserve endangered species. And the two big threats that we've been worried about for a long time are whales getting hit by ships, like the unfortunate baby right whale that got killed here 2 months ago, or entanglements. Ironically, losing 1 or 2 whales to a ship strike or to entanglement, while it's bad enough on the species, if their habitat is changed, the whole species may be jeopardized even more so. These right whales feed on these tiny microscopic copepods, right? They skim through the waters here from January through May, gulping down thousands of pounds a day of little microscopic copepods. Now those guys live in an environment that is fine-tuned to the acidity, to the salinity, to the temperature. If the climate is changing it and they decide they don't thrive or they go away, that will obviously be a danger for our endangered whales. And I'm not going to go into this because I've given you probably enough bad news already. And so at this point, I have to say I'm still an optimist, even though all these things are pretty serious. But if you want to think about the non-environmental impacts of climate change, human health impacts are serious. You've already seen and read articles about insect-borne diseases from the tropics being able to migrate further north. Secretary Kerry, and before that, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and actually going back several secretaries, have made climate change the #1 national security issue, beyond terrorists, beyond the number of nuclear bombs. They know, well, for example, the Navy knows that 32 of its Navy bases are just a meter above water, so they've got a practical problem. But they know that if 10 million or 50 million Bangladeshis are displaced because of flooding, and they have to relocate in an urban area that's not prepared to assimilate and handle them, that causes social unrest. Social unrest leads to political unrest. Political unrest feeds the discontent that often brings terrorists into being. Economic costs, the things we call externalities, the extra cost, start to measure those, and they're in trillions of dollars. Human dislocation, I've mentioned environmental refugees. They're happening already all over the world. Urban adaptations, that's going to be a huge challenge for the developed countries. The most endangered city in the world right now is endangered by climate change. You want to take a guess? Someone say Miami? Yeah, Miami. Miami is not only low-lying, right on those, but it's built on limestone, basically. So even as the sea level rises to come over the top of their massive walls they build, it's also going to go underneath and rise up through the porous limestone. That city is going to may have major relocation and adaptation strategies very, very soon. And there are lots like them around the world. And then I'll just mention this one quickly. Psychological adjustment to all of this. You know, the climate deniers, I think, maybe, and I'm not a psychologist, but maybe deny things just because it seems scary. They want to put their heads in the sand. That's one issue. But think about the next generation of children coming along. I was giving a lecture at Wellesley College this winter to about 15 co-eds, very smart young women. And I get to about this point in my description of climate change, and I could see on their faces, they were a little bit frightened. I said, I'm not trying to frighten you, I'm just trying to talk about how we have to move forward. But I realized at that point, we have to really start talking about our young people. Mon Cochran is here tonight, and he's put together a pioneering program called the Global Warming Express. It's going to happen right out here, where he's going to have 20 young people this summer, talking to each other about this future life that they're going to have to deal with. Very important concept, and we have to have that all around the country and the world. But I'm going to leave all those for some other discussion. What's ahead? I'm going to wrap up quickly now. Well, when those 196 presidents come back in 5 years, they're going to have to put a price on carbon. Right? They didn't want to tackle this subject matter or this topic in Paris because it's a controversial one, but we have to have a real price on all the costs of living in a carbon fossil fuel society. And if we do that, it will accelerate the shift to renewables. One place to start is to decarbonize transportation. Major urban systems, mass transportation, we can make a lot of progress there right away. And here's that number again. One of the preliminary studies is showing extreme external costs from carbon. We'll have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. This number startled me, but this has been validated in several studies. Right now, collectively, governments around the world subsidize our major oil and gas companies, the United States and beyond, to the tune of $650 billion a year to go out and drill for oil and gas, create what they do, and pump the the carbon dioxide into the air. That has to change. That number has to be shifted to renewables and conservation. And of course, as you can imagine, to do that, somehow there's going to have to be a political counterforce because those fossil fuel industries have a lot of sway to get $650 billion every year. That's going to have to be a part of the campaign of change. The private sector has to step up, and I said earlier, they are certainly, in my estimation, ready to do it. The private investors, Bill Gates was there with 29 other of his billionaire colleagues that he hangs out with. And he's committed to have a fund that they say will attract another almost $1 trillion investment. That's powerful stuff. I had the privilege, unique thing, to be in a little post-conference reception, little restaurant deal with Secretary Kerry and Sir Richard Branson. And the take-home moment for me was Branson said to Secretary Kerry, this Paris Agreement has finally sent the signal to the aviation industry that they can now green their industry. So there's so much we can do. Lighten airplanes, do different routes, do all kinds of computer-assisted stuff to make it less fuel polluting. He said, but we didn't know if the governments would back us up, if the policies would be in place, if we'd have regulatory permission to do it, or if the funding would follow. Now they do it, and of course he's a pretty innovative entrepreneur anyway, but hopefully the rest of the industry will follow. So I mentioned this before. Let me just introduce this topic. Am I running out of time? I don't have my watch. How are we doing, Fran? Right? Okay. Here's what I like to suggest. I go right to it. And we've already started to make some progress. Tonight, the individuals who will join me up here to answer questions and enter in a dialogue with you have agreed that there's so many resources here on Cape Cod through all our various science organizations, education organizations, businesses, schools, and we're all trying to do our little bits and pieces to educate people about the climate and about the environment and to maybe make some difference. But if we come together using the Paris model to become the Cape Cod model, I'm proposing that we had 196 presidents who could find consensus in Paris. Why can't we find 196 organizations or entities on Cape Cod who could come together and voluntarily make commitments, just like the presidents did, to make a difference in the next year and years going forward? So I can visualize, just like there is on the United Nations website, a list, that's a list of countries. We'd have a list of organizations. We have 11 already. They're in your program. You're going to meet them in a minute. And each person, each organization could pick and choose its own commitment. You're going to solarize your building. You're going to maybe encourage carpooling. This is just a quick sampling. There's a whole long list of other things you can do, some of which are also suggested in the handout we have for you. And then we'll learn, we here, even the Cape, through the Cape Light Compact and the work they do, we can measure how much of a difference we can make. So this is what I proposed, and I think a lot of people are joining in. We're going to launch it tonight. We're going to talk a little bit more about it.
Hi, I'd like to know, my name is Harriet Coram. I work with Cape Cool, which is a little grassroots climate education group in Wellfleet. And I'd like to know, and actually 3 of us came tonight as a Cape Cool carpool group. And we don't do that enough. And not only that, but we have, as you know, dire problems with bicycle access on Route 6 and other places we need more bicycling. I want to know who is taking the commitment amongst you, who's really thought about radically minimizing carbon release on transportation.
I think that's a question that Christy and George Price could both answer. They're both involved.
So are you aware the Commission and the National Park Service and the towns on the Outer Cape have actually formed a very active bike committee, and they've been working with all the town bike committees in order to establish safe bike trails. And the goal of the committee-wide program is actually to connect bike trails ultimately with Bourne and Sandwich and Provincetown. And actually it's this spring, in a couple of weeks, we're actually going to have a rollout of the plan that they've been working on together. So we're actually very excited about it. Part of it does involve share the road in some places. Part of it does involve expanding the state rail trail program, and some of it goes on some side roads as well.
That's perfect. And just one more follow-up on transportation is electric vehicles, and how EVs, as we call them, will fit in our community is going to be influenced by a Department of Public Utilities docket that's active right now, which is DPU 15120, which is the grid modernizing the electric grid, how we reward EV chargers for demand response. This is a topic that is happening right now in the Baker administration. The Cape Light Compact is working on it, and it needs to be talked about. You need to know what's happening, because decisions are going to be made in the next year that will impact how successful and how easy it is to incorporate EV charging stations in your home, how you're rewarded for that. So that the conversation's going on right now.
Just wanted to add one more thing about bike access. So prior to coming to the Cape, I had an assignment in Boston, and I end up at the Cape, and all of a sudden I have people showing up on at my desk in Wellfleet who were on a bike trip from Boston for the day. And they took the ferry from Long Wharf to Provincetown, biked down to Coast Guard Beach, had dinner, got on the ferry, and went back. So it's really a visitation economic piece, not just for people that are living locally.
Good, thank you both. Next question. Yes, I think I'd like to have everyone move along, if you don't mind. There may be a chance later on to come back to you, but go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Janet Williams. I am thrilled to see this collaborative forum. My question is, setting emission reduction targets is necessary and important work, and I'm very happy to hear that's happening. But as you pointed out a couple of times in your presentation, here on Cape Cod, we are extremely vulnerable to the changes that are inevitable to some degree because of how we've already loaded the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. What kinds of actions is the collaborative and its member organizations going to take to help us adapt to the changes that we are all going to be facing here on the Cape?
Good, well, I'm going to open that up for anyone who wants to respond, but first I'll call your attention to this nice booklet that was produced by the Pleasant Bay Community Boating. Each of our organizations, I think almost every one of them, has made a commitment that's published in this booklet. And the next step will be to have a website. My Center for Coastal Studies will initially host the website. We'll be putting together as that little chart that I showed you, and we will have all those things transparent and visible, what's in here, plus everybody else. So that's a beginning, a part of your answer, but anyone else want to respond to that? Mon, please.
Is this on? Can you hear? Yeah, great. A major thrust of the new collaborative is education, a focus on the next generation, the next couple of generations. And there are good tools out there now that make it possible for young people from the ages of 8 or 9 or 10 on up through high school to actually do carbon footprint analyses for organizations, for municipalities. So one of the things that we're very committed to doing is getting the young people on the Cape involved in the process of identifying need and then brainstorming projects to speak to that need. So we feel that the young people have to be at the center of the work we do over the next 5 or 10 years, and we're looking forward to building relationships with schools, with after-school programs. We're doing a summer program on Pleasant Bay for 8 to 10-year-olds, a 2-week program. And this education thrust, we think, is critical, partly because it's very difficult to say no to the next generation, particularly since we've put them in the position that they're, in fact, in terms of these changes. So we think that's an exciting and very important dimension of the collaborative.
If I could, just, Rich, yeah, if I could say from Mass Audubon, just again, continuing on the lines that Mon is mentioning about education, and that really is one of the most important steps, and it is in all of our curricula that we are currently conducting in the Outer Cape schools, from Harwich to Provincetown, from preschool, kindergarten, through 5th and 6th grade, and even on into high school. And it's also part of our summer day camps, which we run in Wellfleet and in Chatham. So 1,300 children through the summertime hear about climate change and the way it's impacting the environment around them. And I think programs such as Mon's that are focusing specifically on climate change and what the young people are going to have to face and how they're going to help solve this problem, I think are really the critical next steps that we have to take.
And just to discuss a little bit more about what we're committed to do, Rich, you mentioned this, but it's really difficult to have a conversation about climate change without mentioning coastal resiliency. And so we live in an area that's very vulnerable to coastal issues. We have over 400 miles of coastline and beaches, and our environment is our economy, which we hear all the time, but we really need to study coastal resiliency and provide decision support tools to communities so that they can address some of the impacts on a community basis, and we can make some of these decisions as a region ourselves. So we're committed to doing that. We've recently received a NOAA grant that we recently kicked off to study coastal resiliency for the next couple of years.
Let me if I could follow up just on the resiliency piece. As some of you know, we built an oyster reef in Wellfleet because we wanted to return the habitat that once existed in Cape Cod Bay. What most people have forgotten is that the tidal flats that we all enjoy that extend from Dennis all the way around to Provincetown and Truro were once oyster reef habitat, not bare sand. And that oyster reef habitat was helped mitigate any attenuated wave energy, and would probably have slowed down current coastal erosion. That is no longer there. And the same is true of mussel reef habitat, which has also disappeared. And today it is not possible to put those habitats back into the state of Massachusetts, because when a shellfish reaches a legal size, it can be legally harvested. You cannot prevent anyone from legally harvesting it. So how do you create the habitat that isn't ultimately going to get eaten and taken away? So lots of laws have to be changed in order to get back to some of the resiliency that once was here before we removed it all.
One of the things we have to think about also, and Rich touched upon this in his presentation, is investing in natural infrastructure. The New York Times did an evaluation of communities in New Jersey and Long Island after Superstorm Sandy hit, and they found that communities that invested in natural infrastructure like dunes, salt marshes, and those kinds of things had 10% of the damage that communities that didn't invest in that. That's not 10% less, that's 10% of the damage. One of the things that we're doing at APCC is we've set up a restoration coordination center to work with communities to advance restoration projects across the Cape. We ask towns, what are the restoration projects that you want to work on right now that you don't have the capacity or the resources to carry out? And in basically a couple of months, we came up with 140 projects that towns would like to do, that they've identified as necessary, but they're unable to do. So we also need to do some work on the political and to get political support for these kinds of activities.
Yeah, Rich, just to piggyback on what Christy and Ed said, in terms of resiliency, it's going to be critical going forward for us as a region to really get organized. And it's incumbent on our political leadership and groups like us, but you as well. If you look at the impacts on the urban areas like the city of Boston, who's studied extensively the next 100 years impact on sea level rise on the city, the money that's going to go into the urban areas is going to be really significant. And for us, in less urban or suburban or rural areas, to be able to get into that, we're going to need to really be organized and ahead of the curve in order to tap into those resources. So, you know, this is maybe that's a role that we take on and help coordinate with, but that's going to be a critical issue.
Absolutely, yeah. Urban, just taking that up to a global level, the United Nations projects the 10 largest megacities in the world in the next 20 years. 8 of them are coastal, in the coastal area, and 7 of those 8 are in developing countries without the wherewithal and resources that we all have in the United States. So globally, coastal megacities are going to be a real challenge for lots of people. I think the number 4 biggest city then will be Lagos, Nigeria. So that's what the future is looking at globally. Anyone else on this comment? George, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up. Rich talked about the issues we're having up at Herring Cove and Provincetown, and he talked about some of the sustainable projects that we've come up with, including the new parking lot and the new bathhouse. What I also wanted to let you know, however, as a model, is that those were not unilateral decisions by the National Park Service. We actually formed subcommittees that involved state, county, and local regulators that were actually part of the discussions over a period of time. We actually used the model of a subcommittee of our advisory commission. Rich actually was the chair, but we had the regional chief scientist, we had somebody from CZM, so we had people at the table so that it was a much easier sell when we finally came up with our preferred alternatives. And I think that's also a good model talking about how we're going to do adaptation with communities in the future. It wasn't a unilateral one agency making a decision, but we did it in partnership.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Eileen Lindeman. I'm a religious studies instructor at Arizona State University, sorry. And something you just said, I think maybe was a good segue to the question I have. There are so many people at the table, and this is like really amazing to have all of you here. We have people in transportation and in government and all these different areas. One of the things that I teach about is that intersection of religion and science, that people think that religion and science are at odds and they're not as opposed as people think. There's a lot of common ground to be explored. I'm wondering if religious leaders have been brought into the conversation, or if anyone has reached out to churches, synagogues, worship communities to get their input and their buy-in.
They are more than welcome, and we would love to have religious community organizations be part of this group. And I agree with you. I mean, the Pope has become really a leader in speaking about this, as have other theologians and other religions around the world. So I think the issue of climate change is a moral issue in many ways. Mon referred to, like, what are we leaving in the next generation? Have we been selfish? How do we help reverse these trends. I think those are moral questions, and I think the theologians should speak up and be part of it. Good suggestion.
Yeah, there is a group on Cape Cod of clergymen who are committed to the environment and particularly to environmental justice. And they've been engaged in the whole realm of environmental challenges facing Cape Cod. So they're there, they're at the table, and they're part of the process.
Rich, if I could, Rich, we have a religion here in New England called parochialism. And we're coming up on 400 years since the Pilgrims, and many of our towns are coming up on 400-year-old birthdays. And tackling something like this is going to require us to break down some of those barriers. When you look at the wastewater problem, we're really trying to have an innovative solution to that and looking at it from a watershed basis instead of looking at it from a town-by-town basis. But maybe it's going to take something this big. Our towns are all unique and they're beautiful and have amazing identities, but there are things that we need to cross town boundaries and break down those borders about, and this is certainly one of those.
I'd like to mention something also about Pleasant Bay Community Boating is actually some of the founders are from the religious community, and I think a lot of wanting to do that for the community came out of their religious interest, but also churches. You have scientists here, you have planners, government, you have schools. All of these different groups are interrelated and need to work together. So I say churches are very much part of this and need to be brought in.
When I do the math, about 196 entities on Cape Cod. You got 15 towns. There must be 3 or 4 churches in each town. You've got 5 or 6 schools in each town. We could get 196 entities easily. Jack Driscoll is the next question, please.
Yeah, my name is Jack Driscoll, and I'm with, my daughter and I are with the American Chemical Society, and we certainly have an interest in climate change. And we've organized a series of 3 lectures, 2 of which are on Cape Cod, and we have Andy Jorgensen from the University of Toledo, who's one of the ACS's experts, and we have we're at Cape Cod Beer, for example, we have on the 17th at 6 o'clock, we have an event, and Andy will be talking about climate science. We also have an event on the following Monday, and
Jack, we can put that on our website right away. If you got a whole list of things people will remember better, if we just give it to us.
Well, that's fine, but over the next 2 weeks, there'll be 3, and these are free events, and it's on the ACS's event on climate change. Thank you.
I'm just keeping an eye on the weather. Fran, is it raining out there yet? We've had to move, that beautiful reception we're going to have from 7 to 8 o'clock outside on the deck. It's going to be inside now, but I think the Wachusett getting prepared for us to move. So I think I'd like to reserve enough time so people can mill around and talk. But let's just take 2 more, maybe 3 more questions. Yes, sir.
So I wondered whether you had any connection with sustainable agriculture efforts on the Cape. You have to I was talking about sustainable agriculture. I didn't hear anybody up there who seemed to be in connection with that, but I could be wrong. And of course, agriculture is not that important on the Cape, but on the other hand, it is a major part of the climate change problem. And agriculture is practiced on the Cape, and sustainable agriculture is an important thing to have.
Excellent point, and we definitely would welcome an entity or a group to bring that perspective to this table. Yeah. All right. One question down here.
Yeah. So Rich, I'm looking at the literature or one of the insert, and wondering about. We all understand that. Reducing emissions is important. We understand it on a theoretical level. And so I'm wondering, when you quote the USGS estimate for sea level rise, anywhere between 8 inches and 6.5 feet by the year 2100. Obviously, that's geography dependent to some extent, but does it correlate with 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees, 4 degrees? Do you know which number this sea level rise is based on? And then I guess it would be great to have a sense of, if we can reduce that increase by 1-2 degrees, what's the relation going to be between with that sea level rise? That's the way we could maybe relate to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just say that number is from the IPCC, 8,000 scientists who've been studying this stuff independently. It's the global range, and it makes 3 points. See, the climate impact is going to be uneven around the world. I made that point. It's going to be perhaps more intense here. It's also going to be the variation of whether or not the low, middle, or high projection scenarios happen. So far, the IPCC has recalibrated its estimates 3 or 4, maybe 5 times, I don't remember, and each time what they thought was the conservative high number has become the real number. So that whole scale keeps moving up. So, but I can't give you the exact rate number for this. Graham Geis, my coastal geologist, would, and it brings me to my second point. That's the kind of question that having a Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative website with all this information available to everybody, where you can get that information, share it, will be one of the benefits of what we're trying to set up. We can give you a better answer once that's there.
One thing to keep in mind, and I'm old, is that sea level has already risen nearly a foot in my lifetime. It's happening every day. So where do you start measuring that from is we're already a foot along the way.
Yeah, good point. All right, 2 more questions, then we'll stop. Yeah, over there in the turquoise, I think. Something. Teal.
Hi, my name's Patty Watts, and I live in West Harwich. And thank you all for standing up for climate change. And my question is relates to how sentimental I felt when you mentioned the first Earth Day. That was such a great national conversation, reduce, reuse, recycle. Everybody was involved. It was the first time we had multicultural in our vocabulary, diversity, and the youth were so charged up about it. And I'm wondering what the difference is with this conversation, because I feel like climate change is so important and nobody really, it's not the foundation of what we're talking about. And with 25 years in the nonprofit sector, I understand there's so much competition for your messaging and for your funding. Why hasn't climate change come to the forefront of every issue, especially with the youth?
Hello. A couple of things. First, it feels like it's further away. So that I remember in the 1970s when my kids were in elementary school, this was in Ithaca, New York, and they started hearing about recycling. And pretty soon my 9-year-old daughter came home. I was about to throw a aluminum can in the trash. She said, "Papa, you can't do that. You're supposed to recycle that." And they've got a place down in Ithaca now where you can do that. So she was teaching me. It was a child teaching an adult what needed to happen. And I think that is exactly the process that we need to engage in now with kids, that in turn will, I think, move all of us adults forward. So actually, I think we're on a tipping point, and I think we can make a huge difference by working with kids in that way.
Well, I was just going to say, I think climate change is a really big problem, and it feels maybe overwhelming and global. And I think in some ways, building resiliency and working on adaptation might make it more local and make people and children especially more able to focus on it and think about it. But I think it's a challenging problem, and it sometimes turns people away.
Good. Well, this group did not get turned away. I want to end by thanking you for your attendance. And by the way, I'll just say, this collaborative is built around organizations, but organizations are populated by people, us. So it doesn't let us off the hook. You can do things individually. Eventually, I think as this grows, and I envision it will grow, we'll have lots of opportunities for people as organizations or as individuals to help make a difference. So I want to leave you with the request to make sure you pay attention. You can look at the Center for Coastal Studies website. That's where we'll first have the collaborative information up in the next few months. We want to develop it among ourselves a little bit more, but then it's going to be open, and we want everyone to join, because it is really a campaign, and it's a campaign that we can win. I don't want to leave anyone walking out the door feeling it's the end of the world. It could be a quite different world in some regards, but it's not the end of the world, but we have a chance to make it less catastrophic if we act together.